Well, hello to all you art-loving stitchers out there. uh, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the lighting today, which is quite ironic when you consider that I'm going to be doing the Impressionists. Now, the title of this video is The Impressionists, Rebels with a Cause. And it's very unusual for me to think of a title before I've actually done the video. So, it just occurred to me that they were rebels and they did have a cause. So anyway, I have sheafs of papers here. I've got books all around me. I've got the iPad at the ready to show you. So it's going to be fairly loose, which is what usually happens when I do a video about art, or generally, I think my videos tend to be a bit loose. Now this one, because it's such a vast subject, there are two that I have deliberately not left out. I mean, I'll probably mention them, but I'll have to do them separately, I think, because they tended to be separate anyway from the group of artists that I'm going to be talking about, and that's Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec. So those two artists I'm going to do in a separate video a bit later, because they were just a little bit more quirky than the others, put it that way. Now, how do I start this? I think what I'll probably do is just give you a list of the names. Now, that's the other thing I want to say. There are chances that there are going to be cuts in this video because when I'm shuffling about, or I think I'm just doing it, I'm wasting your time, I'm just going to cut bits out that if I've repeated myself too much, or, if I go looking for something. So I thought that I'd just warn you of that before we get underway. So I'll just talk to you about the main ones. And that is Manet, not to be confused with Monet. That'll come in a little bit later. Manet, Cézanne, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Lautrec, Basile, Pissarro, and there's Alfred Sisley. And I haven't really done anything on Sisley, I have to confess. So anyway, we'll just go from there. Now, in the 19th century, there were a group of artists in France who started to paint landscapes and scenes of everyday life. This was a departure from what was expected as art. Now, I'm going to show you now what people of that time expected to see when they went to the Salon, which was the big art gallery in Paris, because this movement began in France, the Impressionist movement. So anyway, I'll just show you some of the pictures so you can get an idea, before I show you the Impressionist paintings, what the average person that went to the Salon and saw all the paintings, which were absolutely crammed together, these paintings. I've got a picture here that I'll show you later, so that you can see that there were thousands of pictures, all every year presented to the public, in the hopes that the artist could make a name for himself and make money to live and paint more. Anyway, so this is the sort of thing that they would have wanted or expected to see. Now, this particular one was by Ingres. So there's that one. And she looks like she was a gentle lady of noble birth. And then pictures from history, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, biblical scenes. And these were all painted in the studio. This is Hercules burning himself on the pyre in the presence of his friend. Akimov. 1754 to 1814. Well, this is early, earlier than the Impressionists, but it's just to give you a feel of the kind of thing that the public went to see or expected to see. Then we would have something like this: The Birth of Venus, Alexandre Cabanel, 1863. And you can see the subject is central, and these were all painted in the studio, under studio conditions. And then we have this one. This is in 1829, Charles de la Fosse, Theseus and Ariadne. So that is the kind of painting that the people would expect. So the Impressionists had other ideas. They could paint in the traditional way, and one of them, Camille Pissarro, he did do that. He tended to, Pissarro was the kind of character that the other artists, he was older than the other Impressionists, and he was always there for discussion. He was someone that, he had a gentle presence, shall we say, and a steadying influence over the group. He calmed them down, if they were fighting. At one stage, apparently, someone challenged someone to a duel when they all got together. They used to get together in a cafe and discuss all their opinions about where art was going and where they thought it should be going. But I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So anyway, let's get back to my great sheaf of papers here. So instead of painting mythology and all that sort of thing and classical scenes, which is what the government expounded at the time, Napoleon III was, the leader at the time, because they went from a republic to basically a one-man state, and then they went back to a republic again in France. So at the time, this Napoleon was running the place anyway, and there was a lot of unrest with talk of a war coming between Prussia and France. And so the Salon was trying to promote patriotism and order and tradition. So it was having none of what the Impressionists were about, put it that way. So now the idea of the Impressionists was, instead of creating paintings with this kind of ethereal, romantic, classical look, shall we say, they wanted to go out and paint people in the fields, everyday life, everyday activities. They wanted to paint nature as the light affected it. So they had a completely different approach to painting, and they wanted people to see their work, naturally enough. But the Salon, it wasn't having any of it. So there became a conflict between the Impressionists and the Salon. So anyway, let's see. Their major goal was to capture movement and life that they saw and show it in the now time on the canvas. Because of this, they often painted in thick brush strokes that were quick, and people said they were haphazard that looked at their works. Pre-Impressionism, the brush strokes of artists tended to be flatter and neatly placed on the surface of the canvas, so much so that they could barely be seen. So that's that little bit there. Oh, now I won't do all the birth dates and everything. I'll just give you an idea of the era. They were all born in the early 1830s to 1840s. Yeah, see, Lautrec came much later. He was 1864 he was born. But most of them were born around the same time, between the 1830s and the 1840s. Okay, so now then. A group of men started to draw and paint landscapes and scenes from everyday life, like working, sleeping, sweeping, and bathing. These are seen as normal now, but in the 19th century, most art in Europe was of grander subjects. Impressionists did not try to create a realistic picture. They tended to paint an impression of what the person, object, or landscape looked like to them. They wanted to capture the movement of life and what they saw as if it were happening right now. They painted quickly and used quick, irregular brush strokes. Most pre-impressionist paintings have flatter, neater brush strokes that you cannot really see. Before Impressionism, landscapes were often depicted from the imagination of the artist. Perfect classical scenes. The Impressionists painted outdoors and were fascinated at the change of light and colour. Now, Manet in particular was very keen on the outdoor painting, and he used to, get his friends together, Renoir and who was the other one that used to go with him? There was Renoir and it's amazing how things just fly out of your head. Anyway, someone else used to come along. Basile used to come along as well. Now, Basile was very handy because his parents had money and they didn't seem to mind him spending it where he wished. So the other artists that didn't have much money, like Manet and Renoir, they used to, Basile used to, give them a little bit of extra for paints and everything. Because that must have been very annoying for those artists that didn't have a lot of money. They want to paint, but oil paints cost a lot of money. And it must have been, they lived on very meagre rations just so that they could afford the equipment they needed to do that painting, which was a passion for them. They just had to do it. Now then. Now, Camille Pissarro, which I've mentioned him before, his advice for anyone, I'll show you some, that's what I was going to do. I was going to show you some of their work so that you could actually see what I was rattling on about, because I've done the pre-impressionist. So I'll just show you I've done the realist ones. I'll just show you now. Here's a picture of the salon, the inside, the interior, just so that you can see how paintings were crammed one on top of the other. And of course, if the salon didn't approve of what you'd put in, if they'd accepted it but grudgingly, they would sky a painting. In other words, they put it up near the roof somewhere so that a lot of people couldn't even see them very well. So anyway, and see, Camille Pissarro, he actually, although he loved the Impressionist style, and he was very keen on it and encouraged all the others, he tended to toe the line. So he did have ones accepted to the salon. He was one of the few that had, every year, there was one of his paintings in the salon, that he put one in. It wasn't rejected like the others were. So I think it more says something about the man's character, that he was versatile as a person. If people required a certain painting from him, he would furnish those rules and would paint under those rules. Whereas the other Impressionists, they got very annoyed and agitated that people couldn't see what they were trying to do. So now here is the one that is supposedly, this is the painting by Claude Monet, 1872. It's Impression Sunrise, it's called. And there are people who say that this is the reason that Impressionism got its name, because he named it Impression Sunrise. Now, I hope I'm getting these in the picture. I tend to go off to the side a bit, so I hope that's right. This painting became the source of the movement's name after Louis Leroy's article about the Impressionists. He said the exhibition of the Impressionists, he declared the painting was at most a sketch. See, they saw their work, the critics and people who came to watch at the time, they saw them as incomplete, that they were not finished off the way the other ones were. But, I mean, that's just divine, isn't it, to our eye? But I suppose really it's all where you fit in history. You know, probably if I was living in those times, I would have thought exactly the same thing. Well, you know, how come he hasn't finished that? He's got very nicely so far, but he's obviously not doing the full job. So that was Claude Monet. Then we have Edouard Manet. Now Manet was sort of the original rebel, if you will. He didn't have to toe the line and try to paint as the salon wanted. This is called laundry, or I think it was called wash day as well. I don't know why they've changed the name, but anyway. Now you can see all the way the colours are all reflected through here. Anyway, Manet, he used to get very angry with the whole thing because he had money, so he didn't, and his parents came from a noble family, they had money and everything, so he could afford to put works in and get them rejected and then get really annoyed and carry on and get publicity about, you know, his cause, basically. Although he did have a very sensitive nature, I think, because at one stage he took off overseas because he was so annoyed about how they were rejecting his work and how it was being received. You know, he just got very out of sorts about it all. Now, here's the boy blowing a soap bubble. That's another Manet. And see, it was the subject matter that people got angry about. Maybe they didn't want to think of people who were poor or living a simple life or whatever. They went to the salon to be uplifted and to have a bit of escapism, you know, sort of like Hollywood in the Depression, you know, how people used to go to the movies to escape their real life and come out of themselves into another world. And they just didn't want to be reminded if they were battling in life, you know, and they went to the salon to have a look. You know, the poorer people used to go as well. And maybe they thought, well, I don't come here to see pictures of me and my life reflected. I want to see Hercules doing something, you know. Now, these are interesting too, because Claude Monet, he was absolutely fascinated by light, maybe even more than the others. I don't know. He just made it his life's work to try to understand lighting and to capture it. So he went out into the fields there. He used to love getting out there with all his gear. And he would set up 4 or 5 easels in a row. And it is famous. Sorry, there's a noise outside. Someone, you know, it's Sunday, so everybody has to bring their mowers out, whether the grass needs it or not. Anyway, so he'd set all these easels up, and he would go into a field with haystacks, for example, And as the light changed, he would run around painting each of his easels to try and get that transience of colour. So I just put these haystacks colours in, pictures in, just so that you could have a little bit of a look of what he was up to. Now that one, I'll put that one at the end, I think. So, right, so there's haystack at the end of summer, or haystacks at the end of summer. There's another one at the end of summer. And see how the light is totally changing. I mean, this is end of summer, and look at how green that grass is. And yet, at a different time of the day, it's totally changed. And this is what he was so fascinated with, how objects could change colour completely when the light hit it in a different way or different intensity, or the wind was blowing, or, you know, there was a bit of a mist coming in or something like that. Here's another one, and that's shows different lighting yet again, different colours. And I mean, that comes into our threads as well. I mean, you know, how people buy those DMC charts and they have the actual threads in there to make it easier to compare what thread you have with the thread that's actually in the palette. But even that's quite difficult, because it depends on how the light is hitting the colour that you're looking at. And here's this one, which I think is lovely. This must be very, very late in the evening, just as the sun's going down. So, I mean, when you consider they didn't have any packets of crisps or, you know, Coke in a can or anything like that, they would have had to have taken all their provisions with them to provide for some sort of sustenance. I should imagine that most of the time they didn't have much at all to eat while they were doing these pictures. Now, what else have I got here? Now this is one. Was this accepted? I don't know if this was accepted or not by the salon. It's not a very good picture anyway, but it's I mean, what I mean is it's not a very good print of it. Harlequin printed them off for me. The Old Musician, 1862 oil painting on canvas. And this, I don't know about this one. I'll have to have a look and see if it was accepted. But wherever it was shown, people didn't like it at all. They just were very seriously underwhelmed by it, put it that way. Okay, now then, I'll just put that to the side now. Now, I'll just tell you a little bit about Edouard Manet with an A. He went to college, he studied the old masters. His famous works include Luncheon on the Grass. Now, I'm going to go through these. I've got my book over here. This is just a quick outline so that when you see them, you'll have heard of these works before. Luncheon on the Grass, The Bar at the Folies Bergère, Olympia, both of which outraged the establishment and most of the art critics of the day. He was seen as a revolutionary in his approach to painting. He exhibited Luncheon on the Grass in 1863 at the Salon des Refuses. What they did was Napoleon III, he set up, because there was an embarrassment of the number of paintings that the Salon, the official academy, had rejected, he sensed a certain amount of annoyance from circles. So he set up a salon where ones that were refused to go into the academy, there was a place for them to display their works. So that's what that was, so that the mostly Impressionists would have somewhere for their work to be shown. Probably because he was hoping everybody would say they were terrible, which they basically did. So I suppose, you know, that made the establishment sound feel much better. I don't know. Anyway, Luncheon on the Grass, I better show you that one, because then you'll see what all the outrage was about. That's that one there. Word got around that there was a painting of a naked prostitute sitting in a forest with two young gentlemen, and there was a sensation. She stares straight out at you from the canvas. So, and I think the thing was, I mean, it's not like they hadn't seen plenty of naked women in the salon, but it was the juxtaposition of her there with fully clad gentlemen. The inference being, of course, she was a lady of ill repute. But, yeah. So there's that one. Let's put that one there. What does it say? Manet's Luncheon on the Grass was his most controversial early picture, yet it had been borrowed heavily from tradition, chiefly that of the 16th century Italy, allegorical, I can't read French, fate, chum. Anyway, I'll show you the picture in a minute. Gave him the idea of a nude female with clothed men. So here's, time constraints don't allow me to go too far into it, but it's this one up here that he said he took his inspiration from. But you can't help thinking, but there was a little bit in him that thought, I'm going to rock them on their heels with this one. That wouldn't surprise me. The critics hated it, but many young painters liked it and were inspired by Manet. They were emboldened by him to stretch their skills beyond what was acceptable. So, now then, I might just show you now the Monet painting. Well done with that. Oh yes, here she is. Now this was Monet, and Monet put this painting into the salon and it was accepted. So that's this one here, which it's a bit dark. Woman in a green dress. And what happened was, people all saw this and said, wow, you know, Manet has actually put a painting in that the salon has accepted, and it's really good. And it was a case of mistaken identity, because of course they mistook Monet's work for Manet because the name was so similar. So when Manet found out about this, he was very upset. And he said, there can't be another person in Paris with my name so close, just an A in it, you know. And anyway, finally he did realise that there was another artist that shared a very similar name to his. And in the end they became friends and got along quite well. But you can imagine how disappointed Manet was when people ran around and said, oh, you know, we loved your painting. And then he realised it It wasn't his painting. Poor man. Anyway, so, but I think that would make a beautiful cross stitch, because although it looks dark there, the green in the dress, if you have a look on the internet and see it, you know, put it on, have a look on your iPad or whatever, that green is beautiful. So anyway, that was one that tempted me to stitch something like that. Now, let's see. So I think we might now, I'll go on to this little book here. Famous artists of the past. A Young People's Guide to the Great Masters. Alice Elizabeth Chase. So what have we got here first up? If colours are mixed on the palette, the results are muddy and dull. This is what Monet felt. But if you lay them side by side and stand back from the canvas, they blend in your eyes to make a livelier effect. Thus Monet covered his canvases with daubs and dots of colour, which only become recognisable as objects when viewed from a distance. He could paint as precisely as any realist, but he chose to capture the effects of light and atmosphere rather than detailed forms. People were blobs of colour in his painting style. From Baudin, this is the fellow that influenced Monet, and I'll just show you. There's Baudin's work, 1824 to 1898. The Athenaeum, or Athenaeum, Approaching Storm, and he painted that in 1864. And there is one other of his here somewhere. Or maybe I only did one of his. Anyway, we'll press on. If I find it, I'll show it to you later. From Baudin, excuse me, Monet learnt to notice how colours changed if the sun goes behind a cloud, or if the air is misty, or if the wind picks up. Baudin would date each sketch he drew, note the time of day, weather, and even the wind direction. Monet was one of the first to paint landscapes on location. Realising he was painting light, and that light changes every moment, he made a series of paintings, and that was the haystacks I showed you, for different seasons and different times of the day. He's even got some I haven't put in of wintertime. And he did the Rouen Cathedral series, and he rented a room on the other side of the cathedral so he could see it, and he painted it in many different aspects of light. Now, at an early age, he earned money drawing caricatures of various people. Let's see what else I've got here. Academic artists studied the old masters of the past and painted things in a sympathetic way rather than what was there. When Monet went to Paris to study this academic approach, he rebelled against it. He had discussions with a group of academics and artists at the Café Gerbois. I think it's Guerbois, and they all used to congregate there on a Friday night, and that's where things got heated and people started carrying on and arguing and all the rest of it, which is what there were poets there as well as artists and various people with political views and all that sort of thing, and they'd all sort of, a little bit like universities used to be. I mean, universities used to be places of open exchange of ideas, regardless of what your ideas were. That's what they were there for. They were there to discuss, however unpalatable an idea might be. It was considered to be a free space where people could air their views, and they were tolerated regardless of what they were, which is not what universities are like today. And, free thought and all that sort of thing seems to have disappeared. But anyway, get on. Where was I here? He had discussions with a group of academics and artists at the Café Gerbois, and as a result he was led to paint landscapes sparkling with sunlight and air. He painted quickly to capture the fleeting light and resulting in thick brushstrokes. His work did not sell and he was often hungry. His friends helped to keep him going. Renoir used to give him food. To save on rent, Monet lived in a studio boat where he and his wife and son lived. From his boat, and I've got some pictures. Actually, I don't know whether I've got pictures of... Oh, someone else did a picture of his boat. He painted sunlight and mists on the water and riverbank. Friends used to come and paint with him, and eventually that's where he met Manet. In 1874, that's when he exhibited an impression, Sunrise, and the critics panned it. That was the one I showed you. After the birth of their second son, Monet's wife died. In 1871, an art dealer was able to sell some of his work in America and then in Europe, and by 1890 he was in a comfortable position financially, and he was able to buy a house at Giverny, or Giverny, 20 miles from Paris. He diverted a stream to make a pool, and he built an arched Japanese bridge, planted willow trees, water lilies, and exotic flowers. He loved that garden and spent the rest of his days painting in it. And I think partly the reason why Monet did that was because he wasn't getting any younger, and he used to like to paint outdoors and from nature. So this way he could just go out of his back door and do his painting. And of course he had endless things to paint there. So I think that was a practical solution to his wanting to be outdoors painting. In 1917, Monet began wearing heavy glasses, and he underwent an eye operation which restored the sight in one eye. He then tried to show in blazing colour of his late canvases what it was for a blind man to suddenly see again. To paint what you see is very difficult to do. Cézanne said of Monet that he had the most prodigious eye since there have been painters. Monet's analysis was that since we see nothing in absolute dark, what we see is light reflected from objects. He saw light as not merely white or yellow, but rich with colour. What else have we got here? The sky, water, reflections, trees and flowers of his garden offered infinite variations and challenge. During the 30 years he painted in his garden, his colour became more and more brilliant, and objects became more vague and suggestions of shapes. Monet influenced the development of modern art. So I'll just show you a couple of the pictures here. There's the haystacks again, and there's his little Japanese bridge and his beloved water lilies, and I've got some more pictures of those later. And here is another part of his garden, just lovely. And what else have we got here? So I've sort of heavily borrowed from this book, because as far as the text goes, because I don't think I could say it any better anyway. So then we'll just do this little bit on Edouard Manet. You must be of one's time and paint what one sees. His paintings were the butt of perhaps the sharpest abuse ever directed at the works of art. His father was opposed to Manet being an artist. He failed his naval exam twice because his father wanted him to go into the Navy. So once he'd failed twice, I wonder if that was by accident. 6 years later, his father relented anyway and said that he could study art. and he went to a conservative art teacher. Manet had a reputation of being a rebel. He chose models from on the streets, everyday clothes, and painted them not with sympathy and understanding, but as they looked. His first painting, submitted to the Salon, was the Absinthe Drinker, a seedy drunkard who hung around the streets. So I have another picture, but that's the seedy drinker there. He's painted him again in this picture, but he painted him on his own, and I'll show you that in colour later. But you know, you can see that that probably wouldn't appeal to the genteel eye of the establishment. It was rejected. Well, there you go, it was rejected. The selection panel did not like the subject or the method. In 1863, Manet showed his paintings in a private gallery, feeling that if the general public could see them, they would understand what he was trying to do. But people were outraged and the critics were abusive. So in this year, 1863, there were so many works refused by the Salon that Napoleon III established a Salon des Refuses, that is, of the rejects, where they could be shown. Most of the audiences were already prejudiced and came only to ridicule the art. Manet's paintings came in for special treatment as far as the insults went. Still, even after that, Manet paid for a pavilion at the Paris World Fair of 1867. And it says here, "Every painter in Paris turned up at the Manet exhibition," wrote a critic. "They all went there, and they all went wild with laughter." These were other artists too. I mean, it wasn't even just the people that ridiculed. Other artists did that as well. Manet was deeply hurt. He would not back down. But younger men were rallying to his cause. And let's see. On Friday evenings at the cafe I mentioned before, 2 tables were reserved for a group of progressive artists and thinkers. Manet, Degas, Renoir and Cézanne. They clashed at times, but out of it came the colour theories of Impressionism. In his later years, Manet did receive the positive recognition he had been seeking all his artistic life, and a number of his paintings were accepted for the Salon. He died aged 50 years old. The public at that time, sorry, I just don't want to repeat myself. Manet was influenced by realist artists such as Frans Hals and Velasquez, which I'm sure I've not pronounced that correctly, but please forgive me. I'll just show you Frans Hals. This is one of his very famous ones. I think it's called, it's called The Laughing Cavalier, but he's not really laughing, is he? But it's a fine work nonetheless. So I'm just getting back to Manet now. I've lost my spot. Yeah, there he is. What else have I got here? He was also influenced by Japanese prints, and I think I'll be showing those when I do Degas, because Degas was very much, and Toulouse-Lautrec, that he in particular, Toulouse-Lautrec, were influenced by the Japanese woodblocks and everything. He felt that they illustrated that the eye does not actually see at a glance the subtle modelling from light to shade, which was taught at the studios, but flat areas of colour that turn abruptly into shadow. The newly invented camera emphasised and sharpened contrast between lights and darks, especially as they were black and white, so they're going to emphasise the difference between light and shade. Manet felt that an artist should look at nature and paint as he wished, not follow academic rules. His own use of pure colour formed a starting point. Gradually, the Impressionist theory that what one sees is coloured light was developed. Manet changed his style as time went by, using broader brushstrokes and brighter colours, as evidenced in Wash Day, which I showed you earlier. Manet has been pleased to... one of the critics said about that picture, the laundry. So I'm just shuffling here. Of course, it'll probably be the last one I look at. And there it is. The laundry. A critic said, Manet has been pleased to plaster his earth with violet mud. That's because of all this violet colour here. Right, and the last little bit here. Manet felt that one can feel the air circulating around the woman and child. I suppose you can. But that was obviously what he was after. Manet insisted all his life he was not an impressionist and never exhibited with them. He always made that distinction, that he didn't feel as though he was an impressionist. He continued to use black, which the impressionists, the other ones, or the ones that were, said did not exist in nature. Even so, and that's one of the reasons I've got the black and white today, just in honour of Manet. Even so, he does bear the title the father of Impressionism. A remark that Degas made at Manet's funeral was, he was greater than we thought. Now, as I said, he could afford to carry on and get outraged and all this sort of thing because he had the finance to be able to paint as he wanted and when he wanted. Right, so I think that's all from that book. Right. So what I'll do now is I'll go on to this book here, The World of Manet, and this one was from the Time Life Library of Art. I've had this for many years now. And we'll just go through this. Now, what does it say here? Oh, I may as well tell you this little bit of information now about the invention of the paint tube. I just thought you might be interested in this because I was. The paint tube. An American portrait painter, John Gough Rand, helped the Impressionists to paint in the way they wanted by inventing the paint tube. In the 1800s, Rand lived in London and was annoyed that his oil paints dried up so quickly. Oils were stored by either glass jars, syringes, or in pig bladders, which artists would fill with pigments and tie a string on the top of. You had to poke a hole in the bladder to access the paint. Then it dried out because you could not reseal it. The paint tube made it much easier to daub on paint and also to carry around outdoors. Renoir once remarked, without colours in tubes there would be no Impressionism. Later, William Windsor invented the screw top, which helped as well. So I just thought you might be interested because, you know, before the screw top tubes, when they went out in the field, they would have had to have dragged along a whole lot of, you know, glass syringes, glass jars and pig's bladders. So, you know, anyway. What have I got here? Painting landscape. Oh, wait on. I'm going to go back to the start here. Now here we go. This will rock you. It says here, Flooded with light and constructed with patches of bold colour against a flat backdrop, Manet's Pfeiffer is one of his great pictures, but it was too radical for the jurors at the 1866 Salon, and they rejected it. In its defence, Émile Zola, who was a writer, wrote, "I do not think it is possible to achieve a more forceful effect with such uncomplicated means." Now, how this could in any way have upset the jurors at the Salon, I do not know, but it did. The light is going crazy today, so I'm sorry about that. It's very overcast outside as well. So there's that one. Then we have, let's see, I'll just show you this picture here. Titian's best known and perhaps most perfect image of feminine beauty is Venus of Urbino, which is this one here. So I'll just show you that painting. And then here is Manet's version, which outraged everyone, because we've got here, she's got a little ribbon round her neck like a courtesan, flower in her hair, little bangle, and then flowers which are supposedly have been sent by a suitor, and for all the world, you know, she's a lady of the night. And what does it say here? After the storm of his luncheon on the grass, Manet waited 2 years before submitting another nude to the Salon. His Olympia, that's what this one's called, was accepted and hung, perhaps because the jury feared that rejection might lead to another Salon des Refuses. But it soon met a cyclone of abuse from both critics and public. Although it was skied, put up near the ceiling, to an inconspicuous place high up on a gallery wall, it drew huge crowds of gawkers. Outraged propriety was the loudest cry against this unprettified Parisienne. Manet had posed his model, Victorine Morand, as an elegant demi-mondaine, wearing a black ribbon around her neck, a red orchid in her hair, silk slippers, and a gold bracelet, and with a demonic black cat at her feet. Her frank stare challenging the viewer, she disdains the bouquet borne by her maid, a bouquet presumably sent by an admirer who is cooling his heels in another room. Paradoxically, because they were well acquainted with such women, the Parisians' shrieks of outrage rang false in a city where prostitutes were princesses, where a man's mistress was more likely to be seen in public than his wife, and where a perfume of delicious wickedness pervaded the atmosphere. Yet the audience was shocked, and would not be calmed even by Olympia's resemblance to Titian's Venus of Urbino, that's the one that I just showed you, which Manet had copied in Italy. Perhaps the reason lies less in Manet's subject than his unfamiliar style. He forced viewers to look at his picture instead of into it, as they were used to doing. The space here is extremely shallow. Even the couch seems to have no breadth, and the colours appear to lie flat on the face of the canvas, and only slowly resolve themselves into near and distant objects. In presenting this bold girl in a situation that leaves much to the imagination, and in destroying the traditional box-like space behind the window of the frame, Manet forces the viewers to work at the picture, to fill out the emotional context, and to create in his mind's eye the whole three-dimensional setting. It is this that stunned his audience, and this that makes the picture modern. And you can see her slippers there. So that's Olympia. And what else have we got in here? What are we up to? Blimey, we're nearly up to an hour. The balcony. The balcony and the luncheon. There's another couple of his pictures. I'm just trying to throw in a few. Oh, that's with that one, the reading. Look at all the brush strokes in that. Oh, I like this one. Madame Nadar posed with her aeronaut husband in a balloon basket safely suspended in the studio. but see, these were the times of great invention and excitement. You know, the camera was invented and trains, you know, railways were being built and everything, you know, industry was people were excited about things being made. Let's see if there's any more here. Now I'll just show you some of Claude Monet here, because he was in Manet's world, of course. Born in Paris, and it's just got that picture, the impression, sunset, what was it, sunrise. I'm getting a bit addled now. And there's another one there of all the flags and everything. That's a feast of brush strokes, isn't it? And what else have we got for him? Oh, his beloved water lilies. Now, I really haven't even hardly touched on Renoir, but I'll just show you. Renoir met his future colleagues in Paris in 1862. For the next 20 years, he pure colour. Sorry, I'm just in the 1880s. Renoir paused. I was coming to the conclusion that I did not know either how to paint or draw. And while the dazzling picture at the right seems to belie Renoir's self-criticism, it shows that he was already moving away from typically impressionist outdoor subjects, and that his painting style was changing to include a concern for form and volume as much as with light and colour. In the end, the human figure, especially beautiful women like Nini Lopez, shown here, preoccupied him. Well, they did say that Renoir was the painter of women. So here's one picture there of his outdoors, showing the daubing painting style. And here is this lovely picture here of Manet. Let's see. There's some more of Renoir's work, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And what else have we got here? And here's the wonderful Pissarro, who was so admired and respected by the other painters. And he was particularly supportive of Cézanne. And Cézanne was a very mercurial sort of person and could be quite obtuse at times. And Pissarro, you know, calmed him down and made him feel a lot better about himself, I think, at times, which is lovely. It's lovely to have a friend like that, because artists do tend to be very temperamental, don't they? Oh, I haven't mentioned Sicily, but there's one of his works. All right. Here's the bower at the Folies Bergère. And there's a close-up. Then we have that's the full painting. He was awarded a medal at the Salon in 1881, and he was privileged to submit work in the 1882 Salon without having it approved by the usual jury. He sent 2 paintings, a portrait of the young actress and the bower at the Folies Bergère. It is a puzzling picture, bold and powerful. And I won't go through it because I'm going to go way over time as it is, so there's some more of those. And it just goes to show the juxtaposition of the colours there and how close up they look quite muddled, but from a distance it all becomes quite clear to the eye. They liked not to mix colours together. They tended to think that when you mixed a colour it would muddy it. But if you lay the colours next to each other, when viewed from a distance, the eye would mix those colours, which is very much like from the science of colour, that the pointillisms people such as Seurat, they pioneered that idea of your eye mixing the colour and the colours being separate on the canvas rather than mixed together. So, right, so now I think I better sum up because we don't like to be too long. You've all got homes to go to, as they say. Was there anything? Now, here's just a little bit here of what Pissarro advised to the young artists. He said, work at the same time upon sky, water, branches and ground, keeping everything going on an equal basis, and unceasingly rework until you have got it. Paint generously and unhesitatingly, for it is best not to lose the first impression. Of Pissarro's work, one critic said, the brightness of his palette envelops objects in atmosphere. He paints the smell of the earth. He was seen as a wise elder and father figure by the group. He was worldly wise, but had a youthful outlook. And I think that was another reason why they loved him so much, because he was able to identify with them, even though he was older than a lot of them. Cézanne's work had been mocked at the time by other artists at the school. That was when they were in school and, the art college. And in his later years, Cézanne never forgot the sympathy and understanding with which Pissarro encouraged him. Oh, that's nice. He sounds like a lovely man. Okay, so I'm just going to go through my papers now to finish up, just in case there was anything I had to tell you. And I think one thing I wanted to distinguish Monet out of the group was that whereas all of the Impressionists were almost trying to paint a kind of a photograph in time, a moment, click, and it's there, Monet was so obsessed by it, Claude Monet, that he almost tried to paint a video. He was always trying to get there. He was always, it just obsessed him more than the others, I think. That was you know, what I picked up from it anyway. Okay, just going through now. Oh yes, it's Paul Cézanne, who, as I said to you, did not suffer fools gladly. He didn't suffer anybody gladly. But he said in later years, Paul Cézanne referred to Pissarro as the first Impressionist. In 1906, a few years after Pissarro's death, Cézanne, then 67, and a role model for the new generation of artists, paid Pissarro a debt of gratitude by having himself listed in an exhibition catalogue as Paul Cézanne, pupil of Pissarro. That's lovely. Of course, I've done a video about Cézanne, and he was considered to be the father of modern art. He was a very complex character. Yeah, they said that when Manet was painting his water lilies in his garden during the First World War, you could hear the gunfire from his garden. He could hear the gunfire. On his deathbed, Pierre Auguste Renoir said, "I begin to show promise." What else have we got here? Now, they were financed by Paul Durand Ruel, R-U-E-L, a silk-hatted monarchist who liked ormolu clocks and created a market for paintings that nobody liked. Now, here's a quote from Claude Monet. "Everyone discusses my art and pretends to understand, as if it were necessary to understand, when it is simply necessary to love. I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers. The richness I achieve comes from nature, the source of my inspiration." Oh, now it's got here, there's a little bit about how Olympia was received, that painting. It says, Manet's Olympia. Antonin Proust said that only the precautions taken by the administration prevented the painting being punctured and torn by offended viewers. A contemporary critic denounced Olympia's shamelessly flexed left hand. The French avant-garde community loved it, however, and it influenced and emboldened other artists. Manet was very much his own man and sought to distinguish himself from the group. And tragically, Basile was killed in the Franco-Prussian War. And of course, he did give money to the others, so he was missed for financial reasons as well. Degas and Manet were in the National Guard, but Basile went further afield. And we're getting there. Just in case anything jumps out. It's a bit like putting an essay together, you know, you have all your bits and pieces. Right, yep, I think I'm just about done. So in summary, these were a group of individuals of vastly different personalities and social status, but they shared this common approach to their art. Monet, in particular, was swept up with the elusive goal of capturing the moving and ever-changing light. As I said, he tried to paint a video. They stood their ground against ridicule, and not only of the art establishment, but also of their parents. Financially, they suffered because of their obsession. So, that was my take on the Impressionists. I'm sure I've left bits out, but that's probably a good thing because this has gone on for a long time. So for those who share my interest and love of various parts of art, I thank you for your company. And as I say, I do have two more artists to feature, which hopefully will be a lot more orderly than this, because you have to pick things to leave out as well as things to put in, and you know, on it goes. So thank you very much for your company, and I shall see you again very soon. Bye from Mary Rose at Stitch Bliss Corner.